Is that going to be?
This week on Talk to Al Jazeera, the troubled country of Somalia faces a new crisis, political deadlock.
I'm James Bays at UN headquarters in New York. After 30 years of chaos and conflict, this was going to be a pivotal year for Somalia. There were supposed to be the first one-person, one-vote elections in 50 years. However, in September, that plan was abandoned, replaced with indirect elections for Parliament in December and then for the President on February the 8th. Neither happened.
Now the official time in office of President Mohamed Abdullahi Farmaajo has come to an end, and without political agreement, opposition leaders have declared Farmaajo's government illegitimate. So what next for Somalia? Will the government remain in office, or will there be a power vacuum? We'll explore Somalia's escalating electoral crisis in depth as the country's Foreign Minister, Mohamed Abdirizak, talks to Al Jazeera.
Mohamed Abdirizak, Foreign Minister of Somalia, thank you for talking to Al Jazeera at a time that appears to be a crisis for Somalia. It's a time when there were supposed to be presidential elections. They haven't happened. Can you tell me whether the government you represent is now illegitimate?
Thank you for having me. The government we have is legitimate. Our constitution stipulates that the Somali government is essentially and practically a parliamentary system. It's a mix, but it is a parliamentary system. And the parliament has a mandate of 4 years. After the parliament is elected, it elects a president who then appoints a prime minister, who then appoints a cabinet. And in that system, it starts with the parliament. So the parliament is sort of the mother of our governance system. The parliament's mandate was supposed to run out on December 27th of last year. But over the course of the last 3.5 years, the federal government of Somalia has tried to have an election, design an election that was supposed to be a one-person, one-vote, which then did not occur, mainly due to the refusal of some of our federal member states. But the political process and the federal government's dialogue, due to its acceptance of conditions set by those federal member states, this process continued. And finally, on September 17 last year, the federal government and the federal member states signed an agreement that would not be a one-person, one-vote, but an indirect election system, close to the one we had in 2016.
Understood. But that indirect election was supposed to take place on February the 8th. The election has not taken place. And I've looked at the Constitution of Somalia, Article 91. The President of the Federal Republic shall hold office for a term of 4 years, starting from the day he takes the oath as the President. Well, after that time, after that 4 years, he is no longer legitimately the President,
there cannot be a vacuum. The federal parliament in both chambers have signed, voted for, by a majority of 215 in the lower house and 40 senators to have a law that would allow for the parliament with its full authority to continue with its mandate and for all the institutions of the federal government to continue. So we have a law, and that law allows for both the federal parliament and the federal government to continue until an election is organized. Now, you cannot have it both ways. You cannot have a situation where the federal member states and all the others are refusing to go to an election, but at the same time saying that the time has run out. Elections have to take place
Well, that is what they are saying. The opposition has issued a statement saying that President Farmaajo's term has ended, and they're now calling for the formation of a transitional national council. What do you make of that?
No, but that's half the truth. It's not the whole truth. Yes, the president's term is 4 years, the parliament's term is 4 years, but also there is a law that does not allow for a vacuum to take place. And that is the full truth. And in order for there to be a political transition, there has to be an election.
How worrying do you believe this situation is? I spoke recently to the current president of the UN Security Council. Currently, the UK holds the presidency. Ambassador Barbara Woodward told me not holding polls will increase the risk to security and stability in Somalia.
The position of the federal government of Somalia is that we want to have an election. The federal government of Somalia wanted to have this election organized, worked on, a model agreed on for the last 3.5 years. And that hasn't happened. But what the federal government wants is an election that is inclusive, not a partial one, an election that is transparent, an election that all the people who are eligible to vote and who can participate in elections to participate. But the fact of the matter is that the federal government has been asking and has been trying to have an election organized for quite some time. All the delays, it is as a result of the federal member states.
Well, we'll come in a moment to their problems that they have with the election and their complaints, their dispute about the election. But just to be clear, you said there can't be a partial election. That's the position too of the international community. Can you confirm, they talk about any alternative outcomes, including a parallel process or partial election would be a setback. Can you confirm that your administration, your government will not consider anything other than a full election?
The federal government of Somalia is charged and has been, we have a president who has been elected legally by the federal parliament of Somalia, and a government that has been given the vote of confidence by the federal parliament of Somalia, that is charged with the responsibility of organizing an election. And that government's desire is to have an election that is inclusive, fair, and transparent.
Let me talk to you about this election, because a prominent person, no less than the chairperson of the National Independent Electoral Commission, Halima Ibrahim, has described what you're planning as a selection, not an election. This isn't a proper election, even that you're planning. It's an indirect election. Isn't it a bit of an indictment of the administration that you represent, that's been in power for 4 years, that it hasn't come to a position where it can hold a one-person, one-vote election?
Absolutely not. And let me share something with you. That about 3.5 years ago, I became an advisor to the president on elections and democratization. And since then, we have included all federal government relevant institutions, as well as the federal member states, to design an election that would be a one-person, one-vote, that would ensure the meaningful and full participation of women, at least to a 30%. And that model has been rejected by the federal member states. So it is not true to say that the federal government did not want to have a one-person, one-vote. It is the others who wanted to have an election that is indirect election. And now it is the truth. In order to avoid a vacuum, this is what they have negotiated. It's called the 17th September Agreement, which they again refused to implement.
But do you accept that if you have an election under that agreement, it'll be similar to previous elections in Somalia? And I quote from Abdirashid Hashi, who's the director of the most prominent think tank in Somalia, the Heritage Institute of Policy Studies, about the last time you had an election like this, an indirect model. He said it was very flawed. The corruption was beyond description. There was no fair competition. There was no oversight. Conflict of interest was rife, and horror stories were reported across the regions. What is being planned now is bound to be flawed.
And James, that election election that you just described was organized and held by the previous government. So we should not be indicted on the basis of the performance of the previous government. But what the analyst is saying is that that election, the design of it is very similar to what we're going to be doing, which is what the federal member states have agreed to. This is what they wanted, that the government has conceded, accommodated their request.
Well, what the federal member states, particularly Jubaland and Puntland, and opposition leaders say they're unhappy with is the implementation committees for the election. They claim that President Farmaajo has installed loyalists on the polling committees and stacked them with members of the intelligence agency, civil servants and supporters.
This is the practice that all previous governments have done in terms of organizing election committees. What is true is that President Mohamed Abdullahi Farmaajo went in front of Parliament on February 6th and confirmed to the whole world that he had only two requests. One was to preserve the National Independent Electoral Commission and to have a 30% women's representation, and both were rejected. This is what we need to tell the world. This is what everybody needs to know and all Somalis need to know.
The leaders of Jubaland and Puntland say that there is a pattern here of President Farmaajo trying to destroy the federal power structure. What do you say to that?
What I would say is that in Somalia, we have a process of federalization, which has not been all agreed on, which is in the process. Our constitutional review and finalization process is well underway. And these things take time. And in that process, Somalia and Somalis have to figure out what is the best way to go about federalizing Somalia. It's not the best time to be debating the future of the country in terms of its federalism and all of these important questions in an election cycle and in the midst of what's supposed to be an election period.
As we look at tensions in the federal system in Somalia, it's worth reminding our viewers there's one piece of territory, very large piece of territory, that's nominally under the control of Mogadishu, but is a de facto state in itself. Somaliland has its own army, police, currency, politicians. It has its own elections as well. It has all the trappings of a state. Is it not time now for a lasting settlement between Somalia and Somaliland?
This government, the federal government of Somalia, has continued to have a dialogue with the Somaliland administration, in the last of which was this in 2020 in Djibouti. The talks have not produced any fruits, but it will continue. And Somalia will under no circumstances give up on its territorial integrity, sovereignty and political independence.
The current tensions in your country just play into the hands of Al-Shabaab, do they not? Tell me about Al-Shabaab. How strong is it now?
Al-Shabaab, as we all know, is an enemy of the Somali people, an enemy that has over the years continued to change and adapt. But an enemy that currently is not an existential threat to the federal government of Somalia or the Somali state. I think the option of having a military and in the battlefield is very important. And that will continue for the foreseeable future. When the time is right, when there's the opportunity is ripe for negotiations, we will see when that comes. But right now, from what we see, we would have to continue to protect our people, protect our borders, and protect our state.
AMISOM, the African Union Force, which numbers about 20,000 uniformed personnel, is supposed to slowly draw down and eventually leave the country and hand over to the Somali security forces. Is that handover really going to happen?
Right now, the mandate of AMISOM is coming to an end, and we expect that to be renewed in the coming weeks. But we want to have the basis of moving forward to be the Somali Transitional Plan, which calls for a number of steps that will enhance such a transition.
The recent report by the US Inspector General to Congress talked about your own Somali security forces. It says they continue to rely on international support for operations, and al-Shabaab is not degraded to the point where Somali security forces can contain its threat independently. It went on, further details about the Somali security forces' operational capabilities are not publicly releasable. They don't want to say the extent of the problem there publicly, but it's true that your forces aren't up to the job yet, are they?
Well, it's unfortunate that the report and others who talk about the Somali National Army do not talk about the fact that we're still a country that is under arms embargo, and that we don't have the capability to equip our troops. And as long as that is the case, I think we will continue to need some support from our friends in the fight against terrorism and instability.
When you talk about your friends, you talk about AMISOM. You've also got an EU training mission in Somalia, about 200 strong. You did have another important force there training the Somali security forces and helping with their operations. That was US troops. And yet those US troops, 700 of them, have all been pulled out by the United States, by the Trump administration. They had all left by January. Was it a mistake of the Trump administration to pull out those forces?
It is true. The U.S. troops have been pulled out and relocated, rather, or repositioned from across the border into neighboring countries. But that doesn't change the operations, security operations, the joint security operations in Somalia.
You were on a recent trip to the United States. You must be quite glad to see the back of the Trump administration. Not only did they pull out the troops, you had the Trump travel ban. Somalia was on the list of Islamic and African countries that couldn't come to the US. And you'll remember President Trump himself used that vulgar language to describe African countries. Is your government and the people of Somalia glad to see Donald Trump is no longer in the White House?
The federal government of Somalia has a strong and historical relationship with the government of the United States. And we are happy that there is now a new administration that we hope soon we will sit down and review our bilateral relations, common interest, and continue into the future.
Let's look at relations with your neighbouring countries, and let me start with Ethiopia, because clearly an alarming situation in Tigray just across the border. The new US Secretary of State Antony Blinken has described it as having grave concern when he spoke to Ethiopia's Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed. The UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said he was seriously concerned, and the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights Michelle Bachelet says it's extremely worrying and volatile. Situation is spiralling out of control. She says there's corroborated information of gross human rights violations and abuses. How worried are you about what's going on in Tigray and what the Ethiopian forces, backed, we hear probably by Eritrean forces, are doing there?
The Somali government and the Ethiopian government have a very strong, mutually respectful relationship. According to the African Union Constitutive Act, we are prohibited about talking about the internal affairs of a sisterly country. What is going on in Ethiopia is something that should be asked to the Ethiopian government. We have our hands
but surely you're not being silenced by the African Union if you want to speak out about gross human rights abuses.
Absolutely not.
That must be an issue of concern. That must be an issue of concern for you. Or are you worried because there are many reports that your predecessor was sacked because of comments calling for dialogue in Tigray?
Absolutely not. It is a matter of choice. And no one is silencing us. I'm talking to you with all the freedoms that I have. But it is a practice. We are complaining about internal, political interferences. So we do not want to be also aggressors and talk about other countries' internal affairs.
What about the reports of Eritrean forces also operating in Tigray? That seems to be confirmed. State Department officials will tell you it privately, so will UN officials.
Look, I would have to believe when the Tigrayans speak, I would have to take it for their word. When the Ethiopians say something about what's going on in Ethiopia, I take them for their word.
So you believe the words of Eritrea and Ethiopia. Let me move to another neighbour, Kenya. There, your government has been more forthright about its problems with Kenya. You even cut diplomatic ties for a time at the end of last year. Explain why there are so many problems with Kenya when it's a place of refuge for so many years for Somalis. Even you yourself used to be a resident there.
I see you did your research very well. Yes, I did live in Kenya, but it is also true that we've had violations of both our territorial integrity and sovereignty and political independence from Kenya. These are documented, a list that is long, and the federal government of Somalia has, in the last 3+ years, has tried to address these issues bilaterally with the Kenyan government. And have fallen in deaf ears. We were left no choice.
You say that, and you say that Somalia also listens to bodies it's members of. IGAD, the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, which is the regional body, sent a fact-finding mission and exonerated Kenya from allegations of violating Somalia's sovereignty.
I can tell you that IGAD fact-finding mission, which was mainly Djibouti, was a frivolous report, embarrassingly frivolous report, and everyone knows it. The fact-finding mission was invited to come to Somalia, which they did, and that was their first trip. They were supposed to go to Kenya, and go to the border area, talk to the people on the ground, which they did not. They were supposed to come back and talk to the Minister of Defense, talk to the Minister of Aviation, talk to other relevant ministries, interview people. That has not happened.
When you look at the situation for ordinary Somalis, it's alarming. You've got COVID-19, desert locusts, drought. You're still suffering also from the effects of flash flooding from November's cyclone. Are you worried that, a few years ago, I remember there was a London conference in 2012, one in 2017, that perhaps Somalia, despite these problems, is slipping off the international agenda?
The reason why Somalia remains on the agenda, the international agenda, is the fact that we are raising hope that we are ending 30 years of lawlessness and no government. And this government has embarked on a series of reforms. In security reform, for the first time, you have a Somali National Army that has biodata registration, that has their weapons registered, that are getting regular salaries, that have their structure, and that are fighting Al-Shabaab. This gives the international community and partners hope. We have also set on political reforms, which is, I think, the hardest part right now because of still the Constitution is under review and the fact that elections are not taking place on time. But because of these series of reforms and achievements, Somalia is raising the hopes that a country like Somalia can turn the corner, and that is why our partners in the world has not given up on us.
Do you really have such high hopes? As you say, it's 30 years since the end of a dictatorship. That's now meant 3 decades of conflict, chaos and turmoil. And you paint a positive picture, but you're now facing a major political crisis.
I have been working with the Somali government and with the international organizations working on Somalia for the last 21 years. And I have never been more hopeful now than at any time in the past 2 decades. And that I say from experience. That I say from what we're seeing and what we're doing and seeing it. But the Somali people will be able to tell their story.
Mohamed Abdirizak, the Foreign Minister of the Federal Government of Somalia, thank you for talking to Al Jazeera.
Thank you. Well.